Hello, everyone. Prof. B coming at you again with another scintillating HI 104 slideshow. So this is the history of political parties in the United States of America since 1865. And let me tell you, it's a lot simpler than before 1865, but it's still complex. It's complex enough. But we're going to talk about the two major parties that you still know and love today, the Democrats and the Republicans. So Democratic Party, and Republican Party. And I'm going over this because they switch positions and places and who supports them and what parts of the country are Republican and what parts are Democratic. That is very important. So when someone says, oh, the Republicans in 1870, that doesn't mean they have really any connection to Republicans of today. So it's important to sort of trace this through. And it's also important because you guys at the end of this, you need to figure out where you stand on important issues and you need to vote. You got that? If you're not voting, you are a bad citizen of the United States, period. Okay, I can sense your excitement. So, 1854 to 1890, so the first hunk of our time period starts in 1865. And this is basic, okay? This is basic. The Republican Party was in many ways the party of big government. Nowadays, they tend to be the party of small government. So the Republican Party, they supported industry, urban growth, education, division of Western lands, and the government having a role in all of that. They were very rah-rah, pro-United States of America. More likely to support moral reform, including prohibition. So moral reform is always very interesting. And which party wants to be the moral party? So we'll kind of stick with that because I think today the Republicans are still in many ways the moral party. And they were supported by Northern businessmen, craftsmen, professionals, farmers, and African Americans. Okay, so the African Americans supported Republicans widely. Democratic Party, they led secession to form the Confederacy. Okay, so that's important to know. After the Civil War, they were the party of the South, and they're not anymore. That's important. They were sort of in the North and the West. The farmers supported them, workers, a lot of Catholic immigrants, as well as some businessmen. They were kind of the party of smaller federal government, tended to oppose moral stuff like prohibition. Prohibition was the efforts to outlaw alcohol. And after the Civil War, they were in a bit of a disarray since they sort of lost the war, the Confederacy. They were controlled by a lot of Northern businessmen after the war. And to put it bluntly, they were in many ways the party of white supremacy at the time. So they were, if you were black, you were probably a Republican and supported Republicans in this time period. All right, so oh, well, who's that? Oh, Abraham Lincoln. Hello, Abraham Lincoln. What's he have to tell us today? Don't believe everything you read on the internet just because there's a picture with a quote next. Abraham Lincoln, excellent. Giving us warnings about the internet. Folks, this is a good example, right? Obviously, he had no idea the internet was ever going to exist. The word did not exist. But that looks really legit, doesn't it? Look at that nice picture. Abraham Lincoln, quotation marks, a little tilde before his name there. So there's a lot of junk on the internet like this, not so obviously junk like this. So watch out for that when you're doing your research paper. Abraham Lincoln was a Republican, but who knows what he would be in 2021, right? I kind of laugh when Republicans are like, we're the party of Lincoln, and Democrats say, we're the party of Thomas Jefferson, when in fact, Thomas Jefferson would probably be a Republican today, and Lincoln would probably be a Democrat. But anyway, Abraham Lincoln. Hello, Abe. All right, so after this, the second period of four we're going to talk about, 1896 to 1932. The Republican Party included some progressive reformers, such as Theodore Roosevelt, but still a party of business. In a lot of ways, the Republicans always has kind of been the party of big business. Still rah-rah America, still moralists, dominated politics in the 1920s. And of course, that all fell apart with the Great Depression. And a lot of women supported Republicans after the 19th Amendment passed. A lot of women supported prohibition. The Democrats in this time period were still very South. South. The solid South was controlled by the Democrats. They worked very hard to keep African Americans from voting because they would vote for Republicans. Because they would vote for Republicans. Today, in the South, a lot of Republican policies try to keep African Americans from voting because they vote for Democrats. So there's a big switch. Democrats were still the party of farmers, especially in the West, and most immigrant groups became Democrats. And Democrats then were sort of pro-labor. And this is one sort of consistent thing with political parties. Democrats tend to be pro-labor, pro the working person, and Republicans tend to be more on the side of big business. Woodrow Wilson was the Democrat president for 8 years. He was kind of a big government guy and very seriously racist person as well. He was president from, I think, 1913 to 1921. And here's a very strange picture of me portraying Woodrow Wilson in, I think, 2016. And I'm giving children something to have nightmares about for the rest of their lives. So there's Professor Berninger portraying Woodrow Wilson in Martin Van Buren's library. It's a good life, people. American political parties. Oh, yeah. So 1932, of course, right around the time the Great Depression really settles in. This is our next period. Republicans kind of were still, trying to support big business. They were becoming the party of smaller government. That's what we mean by kind of a conservative. And the Democrats were quickly becoming the party of big government with Franklin Roosevelt. So that's very, very important to remember. So anyway, 32 to 1968. The Democrats were still the party of the solid South until the Democrats became the party of civil rights, and then the Democrats split apart and they become Dixiecrats, Southern Democrats, and Northern Democrats. So once the Democratic Party becomes the party of civil rights, the party that supports African American equality, Republicans become it becomes the party that's not the South anymore. So this is the most sort of basic thing. In the first half of our time period, if you were in the South, you were probably a Democrat, and you probably didn't like black people very much. If you were a Republican, you're more Northern, and you sort of thought equality was good, but really you just cared about making money in big business. That switches over, especially the civil rights part. So Democratic Party, 1932, 1968, Franklin Roosevelt, president for elected 4 times, can't do that anymore. And they really became the party of big government in the 1930s and have been since. And that's when the Republicans became the party of smaller government. So that's a huge switch. Lyndon Johnson, who became president when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. He was a man from Texas, a Southern Democrat. He really pushed civil rights legislation. And here we see him meeting with the great civil rights leader, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So Lyndon Johnson, you could say, in many ways responsible for the Democrats becoming the party of civil rights. And now About 90%, 9 out of 10 African Americans vote for Democratic candidates. Joe Biden would not have gotten elected president without African American votes, period. End of story. So Lyndon Johnson, very important figure. We're going to talk about him later on in the semester. In some ways, a marvelous president. In other ways, just sort of terrible. So we'll talk about that later. So 1968 to the present, my lifetime, and to the present, which will continue on in a minute. The Democratic Party supports an active national government. So Democrats tend to believe that government should be bigger with social programs, civil rights legislation, environmental protection, unions, labor, still a Democratic thing that's consistent. So they tend to be the party that thinks government has a bigger role in our lives. And they are not the moral party that wants to tell us what to do, though. They don't think the government should be regulating our behavior. Republicans from 68 to today, less interested in environmental protections, support for strong national defense. They're always big on defense. Don't think the government should regulate business. So again, Republicans consistently the party of big business. And increasingly supported by Southern whites, working class whites, and people in rural areas. So the big change in the time period that we are studying in this class, African American, the party that supports equal rights goes from being Republican to Democrat, complete 180. What is also the big change, Republicans go from being the party of bigger government to smaller government. Democrats go from being the party of smaller government to bigger government. And what was I going to say? And regionally, right? We'll look at that in a minute. Okay, so again, the outlier here is the state of Georgia, which is a southern state that they had to count the votes 3 times there, and Joe Biden won by 12,000 votes. Not a lot when you're talking millions and millions of voters. So Georgia's kind of an outlier there. But otherwise, you see the South is now solidly Republican, and Northeast is reliably Democrat. Even Republicans in the Northeast, like the governor of Vermont and Massachusetts, they are Republicans, but if they were down in the South, they would be considered liberal Democrats. Those are other words we have to talk about. So this is the breakdown of our most recent presidential election, and it gives you an idea of what parts of the country vote in what way. Now, obviously, there are plenty of Republicans in New York State, mostly vote Republican in upstate. We are sort of live on the border of upstate, downstate. And of course, downstate New York City is much more Democrat. So just as a side note, So this is somewhat important to understanding where we are today. So, you need to think about which party you're most aligned with and why. You need to get informed and you need to vote, people. Because if you don't, you're a bad citizen of this country if you don't vote. Let me just pause and not pause and just quickly go over liberal and conservative. Democrats are considered to be liberal, which generally means believing in bigger government in some ways, but they don't think the government should be telling us how to live our personal lives. Republicans tend to be conservative, and that means a belief in smaller government. However, they sort of think the government should shouldn't legalize marijuana and should be more regulating of somehow our moral codes a little bit. But think about it, people. It's important for you to think about what your beliefs are, and you need to get out there and vote. It's un-American not to vote. So I hope that helped. And watch it again if it didn't make a lot of sense to you, because I think I tried to be pretty clear. And don't be afraid to pause it and read the slides. Thanks, guys.